Well, thank you everyone for being with us today. I think many of you know me already, but I'm Mark Goldwine. I'm the Senior Vice President at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, and obviously very interested in fixing the debt. I'm going to go through basically the findings of our paper, which we'll talk about in a minute, using the PDF that we sent to you all, which is kind of like a PowerPoint PDF. So I'll walk through this PDF and uh, let you know where I am throughout the process. But I want to start with some context. For the past 3 election cycles, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has been trying to add up the various candidates' promises. Because we know those promises have price tags, and we know that it's a lot easier to give away things than to admit the costs associated with them. For about the past year, we've been doing it for the 2016 election through our Fiscal Fact Check project, and we've looked at specific policies and broader analyses for almost every candidate, everyone from Bernie Sanders to Ted Cruz to Marco Rubio. We really have been doing an in-depth study. And last week, we released our first comprehensive analysis comparing the 2 presumptive nominees for president, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. We have about a 55-page paper, which I'd encourage you to read, and I'll remind you that the first 5 pages are the executive summary. So if you want a shorter version, I would start there. But let me start by talking about some of the findings. And our number one finding, by the way, is that neither candidate would really solve this debt situation, but one candidate, and I'll get to who in a minute, would actually make it much worse. I want to start with some context. If you go to page 2 of your slide deck, you'll see that currently our national debt is on an unsustainable path. We have record high debt levels right now, about 75% of GDP. That's higher than any time other than right around World War II, and it's projected to grow unsustainably in the future. Over the next decade, we're going to add about $10 trillion to the debt, which will bring it from 75% today, which is already a record, up to 86. And then over the longer term, as you see, it'll keep growing until it exceeds the size of the economy, doubles the size of the economy, and continues on its unsustainable path. I think those of you that join this call already know why this is problematic, but it starts with slower growth. As the debt is higher, the economy is going to grow more slowly because there'll be less capital stock. That means lower wages and ultimately lower standard of living. Higher debt also leads to higher interest rates. It crowds out government priorities because we're spending more money on interest and less money on various investments. It leaves our entitlement programs vulnerable. As many of you know from our previous work, Social Security is within 15 to 20 years of insolvency, and when that runs out, everyone's going to get a 20-25% benefit cut. And as I mentioned before, but I'll say it again, it's unsustainable. You just can't forever grow your debt faster than GDP. And so at some point, we're going to make changes. If we make them now, they can be thoughtful. If we wait until the breaking point, they can be pretty abrupt and pretty painful. If you look very quickly at slides 5 and 6, we just have a little bit of an illustration of what rising debt means in terms of wage growth and what Social Security's looming insolvency would mean for a typical beneficiary. Now, ideally, presidential elections are the perfect time for the reset, right? The perfect time for a new man or woman to come into office and to promise to fix all of the problems we have, to deal with our record high debt. And encouragingly, both candidates, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, have recognized debt as a problem. Donald Trump regularly on the stump talks about how we need to fix our $19 trillion debt. Hillary Clinton talks about the importance of paying for programs for her children and grandchildren. The problem is when we do the math, neither candidate would actually do anything to fix this debt, and Donald Trump would make it much, much worse. If you turn to page 8 of the PowerPoint, this is the summary of all our math. We basically went through their websites. We looked at every single policy they proposed. We tried to estimate whether it was a small policy, a big policy, and if it was a reasonable sized policy, we estimated it. And we estimate that on net, Donald Trump would reduce tax revenue by about $10.5 trillion. He would also increase spending on net by about $1 trillion, mostly, or actually more than entirely, coming from interest costs. And so in total, Donald Trump would add $11.5 trillion to the debt over the next decade. Hillary Clinton, meanwhile, would raise both spending and revenue. Spending on her plan would go up by $1.4 trillion. Taxes, mostly on high earners, would go up by $1.2 trillion. And after you add in interest, she would add about $250 billion to the debt. So again, both candidates add to the debt, but Hillary Clinton, $250 billion over a decade, Donald Trump, $11.5 trillion. The implications of this for spending revenue and deficits, if you look at your next slide, slide 9, are that for both candidates, deficits will be higher and spending will be higher than current law. Under current law, we project spending to average about 22% of GDP, which is a little bit above the historical average, but not significantly. Under Trump's proposals, it will average 22.5. Under Clinton's, 22.7. But Clinton, in addition to having higher than historical spending, also has higher revenue, whereas Donald Trump would substantially reduce our revenue. The result would be about 4.1% of GDP annual deficits under Hillary Clinton. We really need 1 to 2% deficits to be sustainable, 3% deficits to kind of hold the line. So 4.1 is problematic. Under Donald Trump, we'd have 9% of GDP annual deficits. And what does this mean for the debt, the thing that we all care about? Answer to that is on slide 10. As I mentioned, under both candidates, debt will continue to rise from its current level. Under Hillary Clinton's plan, debt will rise from 70% of GDP today, already a record high, up to 87% by 2026, a significant growth. Under Donald Trump's plan, debt would rise to 127% of GDP. That means sometime in a theoretical second term for Donald Trump, debt would actually exceed its World War II record of 106% of GDP. Debt under Donald Trump would be at uncharted territories, and under Hillary Clinton would be growing to levels not seen other than around World War II. This next table, which you see on page 11, just kind of breaks down some of those numbers. It should be an interesting resource. I want to skip quickly through a lot of the rest of this stuff. For those of you that are paying attention at home or that want to look through this later, we have a whole section here that walks through each of the details of their plans. I'm not going to go line by line through their budgets right now, but I would love to answer about it in question and answer. I just want to mainly focus on this summary page, which is the next chart, chart 13. As you can see, both candidates would spend more on healthcare, but not a lot more as compared to the total cost of healthcare. Donald Trump would repeal and replace Obamacare, which is a small net cost when you look at its replacement. Hillary Clinton would expand Obamacare in some areas, while she would reduce drug prices and other Medicare costs in others. On tax policy, the candidates move in very different directions. As I mentioned before, Hillary Clinton would increase taxes by about $1.25 trillion. Most of that would come from higher earners, and the rest almost entirely from various businesses. Donald Trump, meanwhile, under his current tax plan, would actually reduce taxes by about $9 trillion, which is about cutting the income tax in half. This comes from lower rates for everyone, a huge increase in the standard deduction, a very low business tax, an elimination of the estate tax, and a variety of other very costly changes that are mostly not paid for. On immigration reform, the candidates also move in opposite directions. Hillary Clinton would increase the number of legal immigrants and accelerate the pathway to citizenship for those that are currently undocumented. That actually ends up saving some money because you raise a little bit more revenue from them than you pay out in new benefits. Donald Trump, meanwhile, would try to reduce the number of immigrants, which, for opposite reasons, ends up costing a little bit of money, but not that much in the scheme of things. Both candidates also have major spending policies. For Donald Trump, really the biggest one is related to veterans care. Donald Trump basically wants to let all veterans be able to buy health care on the private market, not from private insurers, but from private doctors using their VA. And that would be hugely expensive for the government. If veterans could see any doctor supposed to be at the VA, that would cost about $500 billion. Hillary Clinton, meanwhile, wants to spend about $1.4 trillion on a variety of spending initiatives. About $300 billion each would go to paid family leave and to more infrastructure spending. Another $350 billion would go to college education, reducing the cost of college education for most Americans. And then there's a variety of other spending programs in her plan as well. You'll notice a big NA next to Social Security. This is, I think, one of the tragedies of the campaign so far, is that neither candidate is talking about how we could fix this program, even though it'll be out of money by the time today's 50-year-olds retire. And we add this all up, as I mentioned, Hillary Clinton adds about $250 billion to the debt, Donald Trump $11.5 trillion. And if you page through a bunch of the next slides, we explain in a lot of detail where that money goes. So I want us to skip to slide 20, and I'll give you all about 10 seconds to catch up. But I think an important question we need to ask is, under these expensive plans, how do we get to a sustainable budget? Because this isn't the final word. Both candidates we expect are going to have more policies. Moreover, when the next candidate comes to office, they're going to have to deal with our record levels of debt. It's not going to be platitudes and promises anymore. It's going to be legislating, and that's going to require making some tougher choices than what we see in the campaign. So what we tried to do is ask the question, how hard is it to get from here to there? How can we get to a sustainable budget path? Now, if you turn to slide 21, we describe a little bit what a sustainable budget path would mean. I think that there's no one right fiscal target, but you can think of the possible bookends as the absolute minimum that somebody needs to do better than is to keep the debt at current record high levels. That's way too high, but at least stabilizing the debt as a share of GDP would be a starting point. A much more aggressive change, one that's supported by many policymakers and actually Donald Trump specifically, would be to balance the budget, say, within a decade. So we kind of look at those as the bookends, and we think a responsible budget plan would be somewhere in the middle. Get the debt in a downward path relative to GDP, so it's being reduced gradually, but we don't need to go as far as balancing the budget in the first decade. Stabilizing the debt would cost about $3 trillion. Balancing the budget would cost about $8 trillion. And under Hillary Clinton's plan, since I already rounded those numbers, the needed deficit reduction will be very similar. Specifically, we think that if you take Hillary Clinton's plan and you want to get to a sustainable budget situation, you need somewhere between $3.2 and $8 trillion of savings over 10 years. That's a lot of money. Under Donald Trump's plan, you need somewhere between $14.5 and $19.5 trillion over 10 years. I don't have to tell you that's a lot more money. Just to dispose of this concept up front, there's no way to grow your way into this. Economic growth is great. It's great for people's wages. It's great for unemployment. It's great for our debt situation. It gives us more revenue and a bigger base for our debt. But it can't reasonably solve this problem. The Congressional Budget Office and other forecasters project we'll have about 2% annual real growth over the next decade, maybe 2.1% annual growth. That's lower than historically, largely driven by demographics, by the fact that we have an older population, but it's in line with where we've been and other factors in terms of productivity, etc. In order to just stabilize the debt, keep the debt at its current record high levels, we would need growth not at 2.1% as CBO projects, but at 2.9% under Clinton's plan and at 5.4% under Donald Trump's. If the candidates want to go further and actually balance the budget, the growth numbers would become even more extreme. Instead of 2.1 as projected, we would need 4.7% growth under Clinton, and we would need double-digit growth under Donald Trump, 10.3. That means basically if Donald Trump wants to balance the budget with his current plans, he'd have to grow the economy at 5 times projections, at twice the historical record that was set about 60 years ago, and at 2.5 times anything we've seen in the last 50 years. The prospects for 10% growth or even 5% growth for any sustained period of time just aren't realistic. If we try really hard, we put in a series of very pro-growth policies and we get a lot of luck, maybe we could get 2.5 and 3% growth. That would be great and really difficult. To think this country can get any more than that for a sustained period of time, I think we're just kidding ourselves in order to make our decisions appear easier now at the cost of the next generation. But of course, these candidates will have to stabilize the debt and will have to put in a downward path. So if they can't do it with growth or with growth alone, what if they just look at spending cuts? So by our estimates, if you look over to the next slide, by our estimates, if Secretary Clinton won a sustainable budget path under her plan, spending on the entire budget would be cut somewhere between 6 and 15%. For Donald Trump, spending would have to be cut by somewhere between 27 and 37%, meaning we'd have to cut government by a third, roughly, under Donald Trump, and by a significant amount still under Hillary Clinton. Those numbers, by the way, get a lot higher if you start taking things off the table. One of the more disappointing parts of this campaign is the candidates have taken our major entitlement programs in part off the table. Donald Trump has said he's not going to cut Social Security, other than maybe for reducing fraud and abuse, and he said similar comments about Medicare. Hillary Clinton also has said that she's not going to cut Social Security and made similar implications in other programs. Social Security and Medicare are our two largest government programs other than defense. So if you take them off the table, all these numbers go way up. If Secretary Clinton wants to stabilize the debt or balance the budget simply by cutting spending other than for Social Security and Medicare, she would have to cut it by somewhere between 11 and 28%. Donald Trump would have to cut spending by 50 to 67%. Meaning, if Donald Trump wants to balance the budget, as he says he does, if he wants to exempt Social Security and Medicare, as he says he does, and if he wants to cut other spending, he'd have to cut the government by 2/3. And by the way, Donald Trump has said we need a stronger military and more infrastructure. If you took those things off the table, we could eliminate the rest of government and it still wouldn't get the balanced budget. So spending cuts alone just cannot solve this problem. But what about tax increases? If the candidates were willing to raise taxes on everyone, sure, that could make a pretty big difference. This is just illustrative, but let's look at someone making about $50,000 a year. Today they're paying about a 25% rate. Under Secretary Clinton's plan, they also would. Under Donald Trump's plan, they pay about 10% rate. Just to stabilize the debt under either plan, they'd have to pay about a 28% rate. So all taxes would have to go up by 3.5 points for Secretary Clinton and 17.5 points relative to his plan for Donald Trump. But his plan obviously has lower tax rates to start. To balance the budget, we need even more aggressive hikes. People would have to be paying between 30 and 34% at the 50% at the $50,000 rate. For the top rate, this also means significant increases. For Hillary Clinton, it would mean tax rates that are closer to 50%, for example. And for Donald Trump, it would mean tax rates that are closer to 45%. So we'd have very high top tax rates. But again, once we start taking things off the table, this goes from a difficult exercise to a nearly impossible one. Hillary Clinton has said no tax increases on people that are making below $250,000 a year. Donald Trump hasn't explicitly said that, but when he said his tax plan is adjustable, which I think is a good thing because it's very costly right now, he said he wants to make sure to retain the tax cuts for the middle class. So what if we exempted people making below $250,000 from any changes and just raised the top rates, the rates on people making above $250,000? Well, we find that to stabilize the debt, Hillary Clinton would need a top income tax rate of 64%. When you add state and local taxes, payroll taxes, and everything else to that, that's probably the top tax rate you could possibly get. There's a lot of literature on this, and they don't all agree, but there's a pretty wide view that there's some maximum rate where you won't get any more revenue. For example, we know that at a 100% tax rate, people just won't work. It's probably somewhere in the 60s or 70s when you include everything, which means it's somewhere in the 50s or 60s with individual tax rates. So in order to stabilize the debt, the minimum target, just with tax rates on people above 250, Hillary Clinton would basically have to raise the tax rate to the highest amount possible. Any other tax increase for Hillary Clinton to balance the budget or for Donald Trump to even stabilize the debt go far past that. They go to levels of taxes that are totally impossible and in fact in some cases above 100. We can't just tax the top 1 or 2% out of this. The numbers just don't work. And I think the conclusion you get from this is both we have a tough job ahead of us. There is a major debt burden that we have to solve. Second, both of these candidates make it worse. Donald Trump makes it much, much worse. But Hillary Clinton also makes it harder, especially by taking a lot of the revenues that could be used for deficit reduction and instead for paying for new programs. Third, it's really hard to solve this problem without looking at all areas of the budget. We can't grow our way out. We can't cut our way out. We can't tax our way out. We need to do all three. And lastly, when we start taking things off the table, this goes from a very challenging task to an impossible one. We found many more conclusions in this, but I'd love at this point to take some questions from you all.
Perfect. If you have a question, don't forget, just type it into the screen, into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and use your first, last, and organization name, if you don't mind. The first question, Mark, is from William Hoffman with Tax Analysis, and his question is, why is there not more discussion of taxes to fill the debt gap? For example, a small financial transactions tax could go a long way to reducing the debt.
Well, the sad thing that we've seen, your answer is different for different candidates, right? But the sad thing that we've seen on the Democrat side is that rather than taxes going to pay for deficit reduction, which I really think is where it's needed, all the new taxes right now are going to pay for new spending. In fact, I mean, Hillary Clinton deserves a ton of praise for making sure that her plan is pretty much fully paid for. Even that $250 billion gap, that could be closed if she were to specify the business tax reform that they broadly called for. But every single penny of new revenue is already pre-dedicated to new spending. And that's a problem at a time that we already have previous spending obligations, especially for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that are unpaid for, not to mention our massive debt. So I would love to see more tax revenue being dedicated for debt reduction as opposed to for new spending. It's just sadly not where the campaign is now. For Republicans, by the way, or for Donald Trump in particular, what he's talking about is a massive tax cut. And there's nothing wrong with lower taxes if you also have lower spending and a sustainable fiscal plan. But by our estimates, he's nowhere close to that. And it's really impossible to get there if you don't want to touch the largest government programs, Social Security, Medicare, Defense, and Medicaid.
Thanks, Mark. Are there any other questions out there in the chat box world? I got an email question about economic growth, and if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, Mark, that would be great. The question was, I'm paraphrasing, why is Donald Trump's economic growth prediction not possible?
Yeah, so Donald Trump has said estimates like ours don't account for the economic growth in his plan. And by the way, I should mention for each candidate, we did a high, low, and central estimate. I'm talking about our central estimates, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and so we provided our range. Our low range does account for some economic growth. But the two major conclusions we found here is, one, there's no reasonable amount of economic growth that can lead Donald Trump's plan to be paid for. I showed you the numbers on this before, but in order to balance the budget, you need 10% annual economic growth. That's 5 times what's projected. It's twice our historical record set 60 years ago. So there's no plausible level of economic growth near to a balanced budget. But the other thing is, it's not even clear that his plan would accelerate growth because, while lower taxes on businesses and individuals certainly can help to promote growth, and less regulation can certainly help to promote growth, $11.5 trillion of additional debt is going to be hugely anti-growth and probably wipe all of that out. There's also questions about his trade and immigration policy that I think could push in the opposite direction as well.
Thanks, Mark. The next question is from John Brackney in Denver, Colorado. And John said, thanks for your excellent presentation on the Democratic and Republican candidates. What about data on Johnson and Weld, 2 former GOP governors who did well in their state budgets?
So now I'm forcing you to really read the entire 56 pages of our paper, because if you look at Appendix 1, that's on something like page 45-ish, you have to check for yourself, you'll see that we did do a 1-page appendix that goes over some additional candidates. And these were just a couple paragraphs at each. We looked at 3 candidates. First, we looked at Bernie Sanders. Now, we've actually already done a full analysis of Bernie Sanders. We haven't updated it in the last month, but we don't think the numbers will change very much. It turns out he would increase debt levels even higher than under Donald Trump's plan. By our estimates, something like $19 trillion. This is the result. In fact, I'm glad you asked. Excuse me, I have the Sanders numbers. If you give me 1 second. But what Senator Sanders would do, so $18.8 trillion. What Senator Sanders would do, and if you look at page 33 of your slide deck, it shows, is he would increase spending by about $30 trillion over 10 years. That's $3 trillion a year. That's like what we spend now. And he would increase taxes a lot, by $15 trillion, but not enough to pay for it. So Senator Sanders puts our debt in a really unsustainable path. When you account for interest, we think he'd add about $19 trillion to the debt, and he'd grow debt to GDP, if you look on the next page, to over 150% of the economy. The second candidate we looked at is the Green Party candidate, Stein, and there wasn't enough detail on Jill Stein's plan for us to fully score, but it kind of sounded a lot like Bernie Sanders' spending plans without his middle-class tax increases and with some defense cuts. And when we just did some back-of-the-envelope math on that, we thought Stein might actually look even worse than Sanders in terms of high debt levels, that she would probably add something like 20 to 25 trillion to that over the decade. Now, last of the candidates you asked for, the Libertarian candidates, for Johnson, right now the website is pretty sparse. Saying the right things talks about how defense needs to be on the table, how we need to get entitlements under control, how we need to reform the tax code, how he's not going to sign any spending or budgets that add to the debt and how he's going to get us to balance budget. So he talks about all the right things, but there's not yet a lot of policy detail there. As more detail is incorporated, and if he ends up doing well in the polls, we look forward to incorporating him into our updated analysis.
Thanks, Mark. We have another question from William Hoffman with tax analysis. No question, federal debt is high. Though many economists say at the zero lower bound on interest rates, now is the time to borrow for infrastructure and other needed investment. Your thoughts?
Great question. So this country has many problems, only one of which is our high and rising national debt. And low interest rates in some ways is a time to borrow for very short-term needs that you're going to pay back quickly. The problem with our borrowing, say borrowing to pay for infrastructure, is if we borrow at a low rate now, we're going to roll the debt over at a higher rate because we have no plan to pay back our debt or even to slow the growth of our debt. So what we can't do economically is borrow a lot of money now because we have this low teaser rate and then let it roll over into the balloon rate, right? This is exactly, there's a lot of parallels here between the private and public sector, although they don't always align. We absolutely should spend more on infrastructure, and I think there's a pretty good case that maybe the spending should come a little bit before the financing, right? So if we have low interest rates now, it might be that a package of infrastructure would have heavier spending in the first few years and taxes that are more spread out to pay for it. But the Congressional Budget Office actually looked at this recently, and they found that deficit-financed infrastructure would end up undermining itself in terms of growth, and not only would it not pay for itself, it would actually cost more. They looked both at sustained infrastructure and at one-year infrastructure. Basically, they found that if we just borrow for infrastructure this year, the economy is going to be about back to zero by the 10th year. So it'll be about no net gain, but we'll have the higher debt. If we borrow on a sustained basis, they found almost unambiguously it would hurt the economy because the burden of the higher debt would outweigh the infrastructure. What they also found is that if we finance infrastructure, if we have new public investments that are paid for, even if they're paid for not in the same year, if they're paid for over the longer run, it can be very pro-growth. And given how much of our budget is going to consumption right now, I think it'd be a wonderful idea to take some of that and put it back into investment so we can actually help grow our economy.
Thanks. The next question's coming in via email from Mike Miller in Albuquerque. And he said, it's likely that candidates will propose new policies or change their policies going forward. Will you be planning to update these and analyze new policies as they are put forward?
Absolutely. This isn't the last word on the candidates, it's the first word. And we do have bound copies, but we know where to get more bound. So we hope the candidates, we not only welcome it, we're encouraging the candidates to modify their plans because Secretary Clinton doesn't do anything to reduce the debt, and Donald Trump dramatically increases it. What we want is candidates that have plans that put the debt in a sustainable path. We've actually reached out to the campaigns and are going to continue to work with them. And as the new policies, whether they're the direction we want or they're making the debt worse, we're going to be updating this analysis regularly.
All right. Well, I'm going to wrap things up here. Mark, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for joining us. At the conclusion of the webinar, we'll send you an email with the links so you can watch it, and you can take a look at the slide deck that Mark used too. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to email me at Heisler, Heisler, @fixthedebt.org. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and have a great long holiday weekend.